You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 457 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the deep state now using the Russiagate narrative on the 2020 election. In the UK, Julian Assange is in his first week of an extradition hearing to determine if the UK will send him to the US, where he faces several lifetimes worth of espionage charges. I'm also going to look at what's going on in Afghanistan, where the US and Taliban have entered into a reduction in violence pact that could eventually lead to the signing of a peace deal. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I'm the news editor of the Libertarian Institute. I write the daily news roundup there, and the show can be found on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. You could either subscribe to the show on its own podcast feed, and it's up everywhere people listen to podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. So if you want my show, the Scott Horton Show, Pete Quinones's Free Man Beyond the Wall, and several other great shows, you could subscribe to that. However you decide to subscribe to the show, leave it a rating and review. And last, if you'd like to donate to the show, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so what I got up first on today's show is what I'm calling Russiagate 20.20, as the deep state actors, whether they're, current intelligence officials, are the same old characters, Brennan, Comey, Clapper from the first Russiagate. We now have a effort among the establishment media and former intelligence community, current intelligence community, going out there and saying that Russia is trying to sow discord, manipulate, influence the 2020 election. Now, how exactly they're doing this when everybody knows they're doing it seems to be, a real flaw in the thinking. I mean, I guess kind of the reason that the first Russiagate kind of sold to people is they felt like people were duped and everything. But if it's out front that Russia's trying to influence the election and it's, getting mainstream news before the election cycle, that seems to pretty much discredit that, Russia could somehow covertly influence the election. And if we're living in a democracy and in the ridiculous scenario that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were actually both puppets of the Kremlin, if that's who the American people vote for, that's the decision that they make. And so I will say this Russiagate 20.20 seems all the more absurd than the initial go around of it, which was, absurd in itself, as I've talked about on, maybe over 100 episodes of the show now. So apparently the intelligence community has been briefing different members of Congress and presidents and presidential candidates that, hey, Russia is trying to influence the 2020 election. I guess they've told both Trump and Bernie Sanders that Russia is trying to help them. Now, this is pretty much the same thing that happened in the first round of Russiagate. It's the same two candidates that, they're identifying, although the first time around it was more, I think, an anti-Hillary Clinton kind of thing, where they were saying that, Russia was just so anti-Hillary that they backed both Trump and Sanders. This time it's unclear as to why the Russians would be backing Bernie Sanders. I don't think anybody suspects that the Russians have compromise on Bernie Sanders, and while they made up that narrative against Donald Trump, and it stuck a little bit because I think of who Donald Trump is, as much as it's an absolute lie that he was, peeing on beds in Russia, you can kind of believe that Donald Trump might do that, where it seems absurd to think that a character like Bernie Sanders would do anything like that. And a lot of, Bernie Sanders, what, people would call gaffes or embarrassing moments, are right out there in the public. So it really makes no sense as to why the Russians would like to put Bernie Sanders in the White House. There's kind of an interesting difference that I want to just talk about, and how the candidates, I guess, Trump and Sanders, are addressing this. Trump denies it and says that it's untrue. Whereas Bernie Sanders seems to allow the Russiagate narrative to linger and generally agree with it. In a recent, I believe it was the CNN town hall, Bernie Sanders was asked, hey, what about these Bernie bros online? And he, kind of defends his supporters, and that got a lot of media attention. But what he also said was that there's potential Russian bots and Russian influence going on here. And, those are the people trying to sow discord or whatever. So, very weak on Bernie Sanders. It's not like he's making a real, read about Russiagate, understands Russiagate. Like so many of his very loyal and informed followers, think of Jimmy Dore and Michael Tracy and Aaron Mate. I'm not sure if all of those three have officially endorsed Bernie, but listening to their content, they're very Bernie friendly, and they've done great work on the Russiagate issue. And yet you have Bernie Sanders basically just conceding that it happened. So I think the goal of this is to make sure that Russia and the US can't have a diplomatic relationship, and that, make sure that the military industrial complex keeps humming along. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with the reason that Trump and Sanders, and Tulsi Gabbard at times too, has been, the alleged recipient of Russian influence or Russian support. But these are the candidates who, at least occasionally in rhetoric, and I'm not naive enough to think that Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump is ever going to get the US out of NATO. But if there's candidates who say it, it's these three. And so these are, of course, the ones that are, get accused of being supported by Russia. Unfortunately, this is successful and extremely dangerous. So we've already seen how, while candidate Trump talked about, and I think he probably to some extent meant that he wanted to have a better relationship with Russia than the U.S. had under Obama, which didn't go that well, but has ended up being more hawkish on Russia. I mean, he'll talk about, NATO is shaky and NATO allies need to do more, and tries to push Germany and several other countries to increase their defense spending. But at the same time, look at the positions that he's taken in Ukraine, supplying lethal military aid, weapons sales to all kinds of U.S. allies of F-35s and all other military equipment, the deployment of more military personnel and equipment, larger war game, getting out of the INF treaty, sanctioning, Russian oil companies for trying to do business with Venezuela, trying to stifle, Assad and, Putin and Russia winning the Syrian civil war, building pipelines into Central Europe is something. All these things have been targeted. Expelling Russian ambassadors in wake of the Skripal poison, which seems to have turned out to be another false flag type event. Trump has been very hawkish on all these issues. And as much as I don't want to give Trump an out on it, I think in large part it's been due to the Russiagate issue, where you had near media consensus, maybe other than what, some of the commentators on Fox News, that Trump's meeting with Putin in Helsinki was some kind of a mission of Russiagate being true and something that was against American interests, where I don't know how talking to another superpower, nuclear superpower especially, and their leader, and just having an idea of where each country stands as we try to, at that time, save the INF treaty. Now we're looking to save the New START treaty. Those actions can't possibly be bad, and yet I don't think they happen as much as they should because of the Russiagate narrative. We're already seeing this take some effect as 3 senior Democratic senators sent a letter to the Treasury and State Department asking for more sanctions on Russia for meddling in the 2020 election. I gotta say, I'm tired of talking about this. However, it's just such a wrecking ball when it comes to talking about foreign policy, and such a problem, that you just get labeled a Putin stooge if you in any way try to stand up to the U.S. war state, that it has to be talked about, it has to be debunked. And so, it looks like, unfortunately, that we'll be doing this for another year, debunking and talking about the lies the intelligence officials are saying, and then that's republished in New York Times, Washington Post, and wherever else. And it's going to put me in the really uncomfortable position of, seeming like I'm somehow defending Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, 2 candidates who I couldn't oppose more. Don't want to like them, say anything positive about them, or ever defend them. However, if it's a situation where there's warmongering going on against Russia, I just think you have to, at that point, stand up and say, don't like Trump, don't like Sanders, but let's be real that this Russiagate thing is a hoax, and they're just trying to hem in these potential presidents' foreign policy. Trump is on a trip to India, and, I do think there would be room to criticize Trump for, let's say, agreeing to sell the Indian military $2.6 billion in helicopters and Hellfire missiles, especially when, you could look on things like their citizenship law, which seems pretty clearly anti-Muslim, the occupation and treatment of the Kashmiri people, are, kind of the negative right-wing policies that's held by the Modi government in India. And rather than talking about that and maybe the similarities with Trump, the conversation when it comes to India is pretty shallow, like, oh, Donald Trump should be at the Taj Mahal, and this is a campaign event or something like that. Overall, I'm typically a proponent of diplomacy, although this one I have mixed feelings about because of the weapons sale that it generated. All right, let's move on to the Assange extradition hearing. So from my understanding, there's part of the extradition hearing that's, I think, only going on this week, but it might extend a little bit into next week. And I'm not sure if any decisions will be made or not, but the more significant hearing won't be until late May or early June. That said, it's been a great sight to see some rallying of support in London, including the Pink Floyd guy, Roger Waters, doing some work as well. And finally, some international groups, Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, coming together and saying that this extradition can't happen. It's against a free press. There's been a lot of great writing on this. Nozomi Hayase at antiwar.com has had a few good ones. Kelly Vallejos at the American Conservative. Kevin Gastola, who usually writes at Shadowproof, but today had one at the Gray Zone, is actually, or at least on a couple days of this hearing, got a press pass and was inside the courtroom. They said only a dozen or so journalists are able to get a press pass into the courtroom, which is shocking to me, as the press should be really concerned about this trial and should be really interested in reporting on it. And, the fact that that's not a topic that a lot of media is talking about, like, hey, let's move this thing to a bigger courtroom. That way we could get in there, see what's going on, seeing how it's being reported. Most of the media attention that I see that gets into the mainstream is about the Assange's lawyer's argument that I guess this is politically motivated by Donald Trump. I'm not sure how much I actually agree with the argument if you're just looking at true false, but the kind of route they're taking on Julian Assange's defense is that he was issued a offer that came through the White House from Dana Rohrabacher. Now, one important detail here is both the White House and Dana Rohrabacher, who was then a congressman, deny that, that there was any kind of official quid pro quo from Donald Trump or anything like that. But the offer would be is that Julian Assange would give some kind of proof, I guess, to the U.S. government of how Russia didn't do the hack or the leak of the Hillary emails, and then he would be issued a pardon. Now, I'm not sure why Julian Assange said no to this. It could very well be that he didn't feel like he could give the information to show that it wasn't Russia without giving away the person who did it, which would definitely violate WikiLeaks and Julian Assange's pledges and journalistic standards. But for whatever reason, Assange ends up saying no, although has publicly said that it didn't come from Russia. And now the Trump administration is targeting Julian Assange because he rebuffed their offer. There are several other arguments being made by the Assange legal team that I think are hopefully going to carry far more weight, especially the CIA spying operation, where it seems like Sheldon Adelson was the cutout and had this, I believe, Spanish firm that was spying on Assange and helping the CIA. They also alleged that there were some plots here on how to possibly kidnap Assange by leaving the door open and allowing the Americans to quickly swoop in and drag him out, or to poison Assange or in some other way assassinate. They also point out that after Assange was removed from the embassy, the U.S. was given access to a lot of his privileged and legal documents. And so, this means that Assange can't get a fair trial in the U.S. And of course, that should be problematic. And so I'm sure there's other legal arguments going on that I don't understand well enough to talk in detail about the show, but definitely check out the articles that I've talked about at antiwar.com, Gray Zone. The Intercept had a good one, The American Conservative. Stay up to date on this. It's a very important issue, and this is the fight for a free press going on right now, and either Assange not being extradited to the U.S. or a popular movement coming up to try to in some way, prevent the U.S. persecution of this guy is really important. Trump threatened more sanctions against Venezuela's oil sector. I'm not sure exactly what he's able to sanction at this point that would in any real way hurt the Venezuelan economy more than it has been already. But, with last week targeting the Russian company with sanctions because they transport Venezuelan oil, it looks like he's going to try to find some way to cut more oil flow to Venezuela's few remaining customers like India and China. All right, in Afghanistan, there's this interesting story. The Afghan election that happened in September of 2019, the incumbent Ghani finally got recognized as winning the election, which is contested. And, at this point, it seems fair to really question the authenticity of the election. It was low voter turnout. Several polling sites never opened. There's allegations of voter fraud all over the place. This is the kind of election that makes the Iowa caucus end up looking good, right? So despite all of that, the Afghan Election Commission claims that, again, the incumbent wins in a slight, by 0.6%, gets the majority and gets to claim victory. However, the U.S. is asking him to put off his inauguration. And apparently the Afghan government has agreed to this. Now, it does seem like somewhat of poor timing to try to play out this political situation right as we also have a non-violence pact going on and the U.S. and Taliban are trying to wrap up the war. But him not, kind of officially starting being inaugurated for a second term is, I think, something that's actually going to allow for more instability, probably delegitimize the Afghan government to whatever extent still has legitimacy in the eyes of the Afghan people. As they kind of realize that, hey, our government must be a real joke if another government could tell our leader to hold off on his inauguration. So, this political instability at this time, it seems to me to be really dangerous in undermining the nonviolence pact and the potential signing of the peace deal. As far as I understand so far, it's going well. The Taliban say they have been given orders to maintain defensive positions. I've read one report of a Taliban attack on an Afghan checkpoint that apparently killed 6 Afghan soldiers. There's been reports of, skirmishes and fighting in other places, but it seems to me that all the reporting I'm reading, everybody is saying that, yeah, violence is definitely down right now. So, I suppose we need to hold our breath for another few days that this nonviolence pact holds on. And then the deal's supposed to be that the 29th, the last day of February, the U.S. and Taliban will sign the peace deal. Now, there's some questions about the peace deal as far as what's actually in it. Publicly, it kind of just lays out the basic demands of both sides. Eventually, U.S. forces will leave and the Taliban will make sure Al-Qaeda won't come back. Which, if that's the peace deal being signed, it seemed really unfortunate because that probably could have been signed in 2002. But there are reports that there's secret annexes in the deal that may actually allow the U.S. to retain a troop presence in Afghanistan. I find it unlikely that the Taliban would sign a deal if that's the case, but, the Taliban long position has been that we're going to keep fighting until all foreign troops are gone. And if, maybe they're looking to walk that back a little bit and allow some foreign troops to stay in the country, maybe they want that in secret so that they don't look weak to their own. Anyways, at this point, it's all speculation because nobody, as far as I could tell, publicly has a copy of the peace deal in any potential secret annexes. The special general for the Afghan reconstruction said that the U.S. lacks a counter-opium policy in Afghanistan. This, won't be concerning, but if the peace deal doesn't get signed, the U.S. has, especially under Trump, shown that they're willing to target the opium trade to try to beat back or, reduce the influence of the Taliban. And so if the, peace deal for some reason falls through, whether it's Trump's incompetence or the Taliban decide to kill an American soldier or ISIS does in Afghanistan and then blames it on the Taliban, all, possibilities that I can absolutely see playing out. And the peace deal doesn't get signed, a lot of civilians could die if, the U.S. doesn't have we're not going to bomb opium facilities anymore policy. All right, some other news stories I want to get through a little bit quicker pace. Netanyahu says his government is pushing through plans to build 3,500 settlement homes in an area of the West Bank, and apparently these settlement homes will completely bisect the West Bank for the Palestinians. And, for maybe people who are hanging on to the two-state solution, see this as, a final nail in the coffin. Israel carried out airstrikes in Gaza and in Syria. The fighting in Gaza led to some responses from, I believe, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. As far as I could tell, the only casualties were either Palestinians or Syrians. From the report I read in Syria, it was only actually Palestinians who were killed in the strike in Damascus. In Iraq, security forces killed a protester. I haven't talked much about the coronavirus on the show, and other than not really being a doctor or understanding the virus a whole lot and so not wanting to weigh in on it, something that I think is going to be relevant to what's happening in Iraq is that the coronavirus has had at least a small outbreak in Iran. And there's fear that the protests in Iraq will end up exacerbating the coronavirus issue. And so I believe even Muqtada Sadr, the influential Iraqi cleric, put out a statement, saying to chill with the protests while this potential virus outbreak is going on. I'm not sure how that, ends up playing out. If, protesters will follow, and if this maybe lull in protest kind of just simmers the situation a little bit in Iraq and ramps down tension politically, what the situation is going to be like in Iraq as the new administration looks to kind of form a full government and take over. All right, on Somalia, we have a piece at The Intercept by Nick Terse. Really good. I'd check it out. And basically what Terse does is he goes through and breaks down some new Air Wars data that shows what I've been talking about on this show all along, is that especially in the Trump administration, we're killing a lot of civilians in Somalia, and the army's just denying it, and nobody's paying attention at all. Apparently, recently, the U.S. is going to have to admit to killing at least another civilian, as somebody who was working for a Somali telecommunications company was killed in an airstrike. All right, last, looks like the UN-sponsored Libyan ceasefire talks are falling apart. The Government of National Accord, which is the UN-backed recognized government, largely the one put in place by the U.S. and NATO forces after Gaddafi was killed, is demanding that Haftar end his assault, and so Haftar, who's the commander of the Libyan National Army, just says, we're not attending peace talks. And so if one of the two major parties isn't attending, then those talks likely aren't going to materialize anytime soon. And unfortunately, it looks like the death and destruction that's going on in and around the Libyan capital is going to continue. All right, everybody, that's it for the show today. Hope you enjoyed it. Foreign Policy Focus is on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, anywhere people listen to podcasts. It's found at the Libertarian Institute, patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus, at KYAAALE on Twitter if you want to follow me.